when you turn towards God, there is no toll you have to pay. There's no debt you need to pay off. It's a feast for a Father waiting for you to turn towards the Lord. We back, baby, with another reflection of the Daily Vedantic. The Prodigal Son. Pete Holmes was on the Magic Minds podcast, the podcast that we have for Magic Mind, and he was telling me that it's just such great, brilliant language, to be honest. He was saying that the Prodigal Son, that story, it's actually a much more recent phenomenon that we call it the Prodigal Son. And it should be called the running father, the father that's running towards the son, because that's the heart of the story. But, and I'll tell you why in a second, but Pete said that every comedian has a closer, their strongest joke. And he compared Christ walking around telling all of his parables, constantly teaching for years, that teachers would have a closer. And he didn't just tell the prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son once, but that this was his closer, one of his strongest, if not his strongest story, to exemplify the love of the Father. The story in the Gospels is where Christ is telling the Pharisees, as well as he's in front of sinners and prostitutes that he's eating with, and he is being chastised by the Pharisees for consorting with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, and the like. So Christ is talking to the Pharisees, but through the Gospels, he's talking to all of us when this parable is written down by his followers. The prodigal son, which I've talked about on the podcast before, and mentioned why it should be called the running father. But the prodigal son is a 5-part story, and this takes a chiastic structure. This was something I knew nothing about till a few days ago with a friend of mine, John Mark Comer, a renowned preacher and an author. And he was telling me that in Middle Eastern cultures, the chiastic structure was the predominant teaching structure of any story. That in the West, we have much more linear stories where we have chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And at the last chapter, there's resolution. There's the climax and the resolution, and it all makes sense. And the last final battle of the movie and the marriage and getting that person to say yes in the romantic TV show or book. And that's the resolution is at the end, but in a chiastic structure. The climax is in the middle. And the most important wisdom is in the middle. And then you have this inversion of the story. You have part A, part B, part C, the middle of the story, the moral climax perhaps in something like the prodigal son. And then you have B prime and A prime, where B and B prime, A and A prime. And a chi is it's Greek for an X. So it inverts itself like an X. You think it's going one way and boom, it goes a completely different direction. And they mirror each other. They mirror each other so much that the end, it's not resolution, it actually redefines the beginning. I spent hours yesterday going deep into, I was just so fascinated by this. Spent hours going deep into the chiastic structure of storytelling in the Middle East and in India, because this is, the Bhagavad Gita is completely chiastic. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata is completely chiastic. Where the end, and this is a hallmark of a chiastic story structure, is the end redefines the beginning. It's kind of like the end of The Sixth Sense, written by an Indian. So maybe that's why. But the end of The Sixth Sense, a movie with such a twist ending that it not only redefined the beginning of the movie, and you had to think about it all the way through. You're like, this changes everything. but it was the instigation of like 1,000 mainstream box office attempts at twist endings. But a chiastic structure that redefines the end, redefines the beginning. The prodigal son is, you have this son that asks for his inheritance early. Essentially wants his father to die, wants to break the bond so that he can then use it, and he's profligate, philanderer, goes and spends it all, hits rock bottom, and it's basically like, I am so alone, destroyed, at rock bottom, that I'd rather be a servant in my father's house than be a societal reject that is begging for food like he was doing. So he goes back. And the father, instead of chastising him, instead of listing off all of the ways in which the son that's returning, has done wrong and erred in his ways, the father runs to the son, drops what he's doing, runs to the son to receive him, and they kill. And the father says, kill the fattened calf. We're going to have a feast to celebrate the return of my son. That's not the end of the story. That is why it should be called the running father, because it is a parable for all of us. No matter what we've done, think we deserve, if we're willing to go be a servant to our father, not just return to try to, slide right into some more inheritance, but a devotion, selfless devotion to, I am willing to go be a servant. And the father's going to run after you anyhow, but that is a key part of the story. Just as key is the father running after the son and receiving without any distance or pause whatsoever. And that is the closer for many of us. When you turn towards God, there is no toll you have to pay. There's no debt you need to pay off. It's a feast for a father waiting for you to turn towards the Lord. But there is a B prime and an A prime inversion of the story, where the son that stayed back and did everything right, that thinks he should be celebrated for merit and his performance, questions his father and saying, why are you doing this? He broke all the rules. He broke from us and the family, and he squandered his entire inheritance. Father rebukes that son, and there is this last part of the story where we don't know if that second son goes into the home for the celebration or is so dismayed, distraught by how unfair it seems that he breaks from his father. The son that breaks from the father. It's clear that it's not the one that did all of this irresponsible behavior. It's the one that thinks arrogantly that they are so responsible that they deserve the feast, the love of the Father. And so distraught when they realize it's not performance-based. So distraught when thrown into the chaos of they were going to receive all of that anyhow, no matter what they did. Instead of finishing the story and giving us a conclusion of whether that son returns into the house to celebrate or leaves, he leaves it open-ended. He leaves it open-ended. That is because he's telling the story to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are that second son. The Pharisees are the ones that are performance and merit based, that are chastising Christ for convening with tax collectors and prostitutes. It is beautifully and poetically open-ended for all of us hearing that to wonder, well, which are we? Or are we the son that says, this should all be mine? Selfishly attached to the fruits of our labor and performance. The story is about the Father, the characters that we get to choose, which character we are. It's about which son, which path do we choose. The prodigal son, which means wasteful. Which son wastes the relationship with the Father if that second son indeed does not return, does not go into the household, does not celebrate? We each have our experiences where we are wildly irresponsible, wasteful, err in perhaps every way that you can imagine, but we also each have an opportunity to turn around, to turn inward. In the Vedantic lens, this would be turning from an external pursuit of the world towards an internal pursuit of devotion, transformation, service to the higher. The Bhagavad Gita has a chiastic structure to it where it also has the fulcrum is right in the middle. The climax, moral climax, is right in the middle. In fact, the middle chapter, the 9th chapter, 9:22, which is nearly right in the middle of the entirety of the text of the 18th chapter, 30-minute conversation between this warrior prince and his charioteer, who is the symbolic embodiment of God. This conversation between the two of them, the fulcrum is right at chapter 9, verse 22. And that verse, which goes to those persons who worship me thinking of nothing else. To those ever seeking union, I grant them union and supreme bliss. The me, the capital M, me, that Krishna, the charioteer, is saying is speaking from the perspective of God. There's no devotion meant in devoting to this Krishna character that lived thousands of years ago. Speaking symbolically as God, devotion to God. What is interesting about not only the broader text of the Gita being chiastic, the end completely redefines the beginning. It's also open-ended for us to wonder what should be done. Krishna actually ends the Gita by basically saying, all right, I've told you everything you need to know. Do whatever you want. There's no resolution to it, per se. There's no linear conclusion and resolution to the conflict. It's open-ended, but what's interesting is even this verse is chiastic. It's chiastic because you have, to those who are devoted to the Supreme, thinking of nothing else, worshiping nothing else. To those ever seeking union, I grant them union and supreme bliss. You think the structure, you think the story is about what we do. And yet the story, like the prodigal son, is about what the Father does. And it's circular. And it's almost like a spiral that goes upwards because what the Father does mirrors whatever the Son does. The Son turns towards the Father. The Father is there to receive and running towards the Son. The seeker of peace, bliss, union is met by the granter of peace, bliss, union. But the peace, the bliss, the union, the receptivity, the feast, it doesn't come from anything that you and I do. It doesn't come from anything that the Son does. It's the nature of the Father to provide this. It's the nature of the Lord to provide this, according to this verse in the Gita. We think it's what we do so much that even in hearing a verse like this, or hearing the prodigal son, we still think it's the Son. We still think it's our decisions, our devotion. Because that's all we can think of in our limited minds. All we can think of are what we do and what we get out of it. We think in business. We think in transactions. We think in selfish transactions of this is what I do and this is what I am going to get. We could hear this 1,000 times and still hear it from the lens, as the phrase goes, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, and still think in terms of, well, it's the Son that did that. It is the one that is devoted to the higher, that worships nothing else, that has granted this union and bliss. And that's the opposite, the exact diametrical, structural opposite of what is being said. Luckily, with the chiastic structure in the last 2 days, I literally sat there for about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours yesterday, thinking about this to understand chiastic structure, how it's used, how it redefines the beginning of each story, and that has a chiastic structure to it. And it is this, like I said, this spiral upwards of meaning. But one thing is very clear about the prodigal son. The story isn't about the wastefulness of the first son. The story, the resolution comes from the father, but the story is actually about the second son. That thinks it comes down to what we do. That's not what Christ is saying. The emphasis is not on what we do. If anything, it's on everything that we do being in the wrong direction. In this same exchange, Christ literally calls out saying that what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination to God. Later on, he'd say to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You're thinking thoughts of man and I'm thinking thoughts of God." They are not just in opposition, they're completely inverted. Thinking that we have done anything or can do anything to merit the reception of the divine, of God, of the self. It's our natural state, and all of the things that we're doing are actually pulling us apart. And the very notion that it's a transaction, a performance-based transaction, where we get something in return for what we do. That is the basis of the misinterpretation, the entirety of the culture that Christ is speaking to. It's quite trippy because that culture, our culture now, tells us over and over and over, your value is based on what you do. I would posit that your value, our greatness, is much more based on what we don't do than what we do. But even when we find ourselves miles from where we know we ought to be, our natural state, our harmony, is just a U-turn away, approaching with a devoted heart, a servant's heart towards the higher. And we are told from a few major traditions that the result is a feast of nearly unimaginable proportions. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.